The Iranian-led axis of evil has suffered lethal setbacks over the past year, including the Iranian-led axis of evil has suffered lethal setbacks over the past year, including the elimination of the Hamas brigades in Gaza, the destruction and retreat of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the fall of the al-Assad regime in Syria. Iran itself has suffered huge losses in Israeli airstrikes. Yet the Houthis continue to attack and remain the last proxy standing in the Iranian arsenal. However, that could soon change. More from ILTV's Devo Klein.
Over 1 million Israelis were forced to shelter in central Israel yesterday due to a drone detection from the Houthi rebels in Yemen. After the destruction of Hamas capabilities and Hezbollah in a ceasefire agreement, and Iran in a holding pattern, only the Houthis remain committed to launching attacks on Israel as long as the war in Gaza continues.
إن القوات المسلحة اليمنية مستمرة في مواصلة تنفيذ عملياتها العسكرية وضرب كافة الأهداف التابعة للعدو الإسرائيلي في الأراضي المحتلة، وإن هذه العمليات لن تتوقف إلا بوقف العدوان على غزة ورفع الحصار عنها.
Israel has previously responded to the Houthis with 2 rounds of airstrikes in July and September, but Houthis have not suffered a major setback in months. The drone fired toward central Israel yesterday was shot down without causing damages. But just last week, a Houthi UAV hit the top floor of an apartment building in Yavne. Fortunately, no one was injured. Perhaps the time to deal with the Houthis has finally come. American forces carried out an airstrike against a Houthi command and control facility that was used by the Yemeni rebels to coordinate attacks as the Houthis continue striking ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The targeted facility was a hub for coordinating Houthi operations, such as attacks against U.S. Navy warships and merchant vessels. With the Israeli Air Force now free from major operations on other fronts, speculation is mounting that another major and perhaps coordinated operation against the Houthis could be in the offing.
And the Iranian-led axis has been dramatically set back in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in Syria. But the Houthis in Yemen are still standing. Are they next in line? Joining us now to discuss is British military expert Andrew Fox. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So the Iranian Houthi proxy is still striking strategic global shipping, and just yesterday targeted Israel with a ballistic missile. In your estimation, is a major Israeli and perhaps allied strike on the Houthis forthcoming?
I think it's possible. I think the last 14 months with Yemen, I think we've been very reactive, and we haven't had a particularly clear strategy as to how to find a political or military solution to the problem of Houthi interference, not only in the Gulf, but also with their direct attacks on Israel. I think a completely independent Israeli strike is extremely unlikely. They will need American facilitation of things like refueling and recovery of potential downed aircraft should such an eventuality occur. But I think it's very clear that with the collapse of the remainder of Iran's Shiite crescent proxy strategy, the time does feel right to start taking slightly more assertive action towards the Houthis.
More assertive action towards the Houthis, and perhaps not only. Iranian air defense was badly damaged by Israel. They were just ousted from Syria after losing in Lebanon. Is Iran ready to admit defeat, let the Houthis stand alone, or perhaps is Israel and its allies considering an attack against Iran itself, the head of the snake?
I haven't seen any indications of that yet, but I do have real concerns about Iran between now and Mr. Trump's inauguration on 20th of January. We've seen a complete collapse of their proxy strategy. We've seen them humiliated domestically as the Israelis took out their air defenses with absolutely no effort at all. And really, that doesn't leave Iran with very many options, especially with a very hostile Trump administration coming in Washington. My biggest fear is that they might try and make a rush for some sort of nuclear power status between now and that inauguration date.
So both Netanyahu and Trump have said that they would not allow Iran to attain nuclear weapons. Do you think that that indicates that perhaps now is the right time to strike? And what would it take to actually topple this regime once and for all?
Well, these are really complicated problems, and we've seen the B-52s placed forward in the Gulf They're based out of Doha, and we know that the Americans have been willing to use them against ISIS in Syria. So the option is on the table, and I think that all parties, actually even Mr. Biden as well as Mr. Trump, I think they're all prepared to use force against Iran should they make that rush for the bomb. But it's easier said than done because these nuclear facilities are exceptionally well hidden, and you would have to strike all of them comprehensively to take out Iran's ability to make a nuke, because their system and their process is so well developed and is so far down the line. You'd have to be absolutely certain you got everything. And then, of course, when it comes to changing regime in Tehran, we've seen what happens in the Gulf when people decapitate these strongman regimes. We saw it in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. We saw it in Libya with Muammar Gaddafi. And the danger is what comes next and how you guarantee that what replaces the regime that you've taken out is any better than the one that you've just removed.
Mm-hmm. You don't sound very optimistic about the possibilities of taking out Iran's nuclear site or even toppling the regime.
No, I think they're both possibilities. I think certainly the nuclear sites, we have the firepower in the Gulf to do that. It's just a very, very extended operation. And of course, we have international law considerations to take into play as well. We can't, we will have to sort of face a lot of international condemnation if we in the West, I think, do launch those attacks on Iran and their nuclear capability. When it comes to the regime change, I am slightly more skeptical. You know, Iran has 500,000 soldiers in the field, and whilst they're not a particularly effective expeditionary army, there's certainly more than enough Iranian troops to sort of control any revolution that might come from the back of strikes on Iran's leadership. It's a very, very complicated country. We've tried to regime change in Iran before, and it's gone spectacularly wrong and led us to the situation we're in today. So whilst I'm hesitant to recommend it as a course of action, if we do undertake it, then it's something that needs serious thought as to what comes next. That's the killer question when it comes to taking out the regime in Tehran.
All right, well, Andrew Fox, thank you so much for your insights and analysis today.
Thank you.
And meanwhile, a Russian report indicates that in an unprecedented incident, IDF troops entered a military facility on the ground in the Syrian capital of Damascus for 20 minutes and then departed. And on the Golan, the rebels in Syria have been turning over weapons from the al-Assad regime to the IDF. The items turned over reportedly include chemical weapons that had been used by the Syrian regime in the civil war against the rebels themselves. More from ILTV's Steve Leibovitz.
In the buffer between Israel and Syria, residents of the Syrian Golan and rebel fighters have reportedly been handing over weapons from the Assad regime to the IDF. According to Israel's Channel 12, the weapons include chemical warfare materials. The rebels loaded trucks with hundreds of boxes of ammunition, mortars, bombs, and grenades and transferred them to the IDF. Former Syrian ruler Bashar al-Assad had used chemical warfare to fight against the rebel forces for years, and now that the rebels have taken control of these weapon stockpiles, they decided to give them to Israel to dispose. The IDF has not set a timetable for its deployment on the Syrian side of the Golan. Defense Minister Katz has instructed the army to prepare to remain through the winter and until the stabilization of the new regime in Syria. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, the IDF continues efforts to remove any remaining Hezbollah materials in areas controlled by the IDF while enforcing any ceasefire violations by Hezbollah. Troops located weapons warehouses with heavy rocket launchers, anti-tank missiles, and mortars. The materials were destroyed or confiscated. The IDF has been gradually leaving villages in South Lebanon, being replaced under CENTCOM supervision by the Lebanese army. The full withdrawal back to the Israeli-Lebanese border is due to be completed by the end of next month.
And in tragic news, in Gaza, 2 IDF soldiers were killed today after a building collapsed with them inside. May their memories be for a blessing. And U.S. President-elect Donald Trump reiterated his threat to Hamas, saying that all hell is going to break out if the hostages are not returned by the time he takes office. Trump also said he had a very good talk with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The details in the following report. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump on Monday reiterated his threat to Hamas that all hell is going to break out if it does not release the hostages by January 20th, the day he is set to take office. He made the threat during a press conference in Florida and following a phone call with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which Trump characterized as a recap call.
On Bibi, we had a very good talk. We discussed what is going to happen, and I'll be very available on January 20th, and we'll see. As you know, I gave warning that if these hostages aren't back home by that date, all hell's going to break out, and very strong.
When a reporter asked what the president-elect means by hell to pay, Trump said the following.
Well, they're going to have to determine what that means, but it means it won't be pleasant.
Mr. President,
It's not going to be pleasant, yeah.
Hamas is currently holding 100 hostages for 438 days, and negotiations for their release under the Biden administration are ongoing after months of stalled talks. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden on Monday, speaking at his last White House Hanukkah reception as president, pledged he would not stop in his efforts to ensure all the hostages return home.
I've gotten over 100 hostages out. I will not stop till I get every single one of them home. And so I learned a long time ago, you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. I'm a Zionist.
Biden, along with Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff, reaffirmed his solidarity with the Jewish American community and underscored his commitment to combating anti-Semitism.
My final Hanukkah message to you is this. As president, this is to hold on to that hope. Shine your light. Shine the light of optimism. And above all, keep the faith. Keep the faith. May God bless you. Happy Hanukkah.
And now reports indicate that we are currently closer to reaching a hostage deal than we have been in months. Reports also indicate that Hamas has dropped its main demand of a complete end to the war. ILTV's Ariella Lahiani is at Tel Aviv Hostage Square. Ariella, what can you tell us about the current status of hostage talks?
Yes, thank you, Ladar. So Defense Minister Israel Katz has stated that hostage negotiations are closer than ever to reaching a deal, and he's highlighted that Hamas is showing flexibility on key points such as the Philadelphia and Netzarim corridors, both of which he believes will no longer be an obstacle in reaching an agreement. He's also added that a deal would be phased and most likely receive cabinet approval, though he's also urged caution to avoid any public discussion that could jeopardize progress. Now, meanwhile, an Israeli delegation of officials from the IDF, Shin Bet and Mossad have traveled to Qatar for further discussions. And whilst officials claim that this trip by no means guarantees any sort of breakthrough, it does definitely signal Israel's commitment to securing the release of the hostages.